Okay, everyone, welcome back. This will actually be the the final lecture of this unit. This is the second half of lecture 7, and this is going to be. I did a little research on sort of the Saudi Wealth Fund because I want to show an example of how the Saudis, in particular, but also sort of the region. This includes Bahrain, Oman, Qatar, UAE, and others, right? But this has been like their biggest approach to increasing soft power and even sort of political power on the domestic scene in some places like the U.S. and Europe and Asia. Okay, so we'll start with slide 7, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is called the PIF, as soft power. And so the Sovereign Wealth Fund, as far as we know, I think it's the second largest in the region behind the UAE. Is about 900 billion to $1 trillion, somewhere in that region. The focus in the last 15 years or so has been on asset diversification, right? For a couple of reasons. One, it helps them weather low pricing when oil prices drop, right? If you just have this sort of singular economy, you're at the whim of the commodities market, right? And so this asset diversification has allowed them to take some of that windfall when times are good and roll it into other sectors, economies, assets, wealth funds, hedge funds, all kinds of stuff. We'll talk about it. This also allows for high levels of corruption and bribes, right? Not only internally, we've talked about trying to co opt rising opponents and paying off your minimum winning coalition and all of these things, right, which require corruption and bribes, but also corruption and bribes on the international scene, right? There are a lot of questions about their involvement with FIFA, with golf, with tennis, with US media companies, with US banks, all kinds of stuff, right? And so this is a really easy way to sort of, to bribe, really. I mean, to build sort of quid pro quos, right? Finally, I think that it is sort of human rights abuses whitewashing, right? It's a way for them to say, oh, look at all this fun stuff we're doing. Ignore the fact that minorities and just citizens in general, especially women, don't really have rights like association, that's weird. Free speech. My mind moves quickly. Free speech, etc. All right. So how are they doing this? There are a lot of ways, right? They are again trying to diversify. But they have been buying up huge chunks of businesses, building out museums, building a whole new cities. Um, we'll talk about they had the comedy show in Riyadh, all of these sorts of things, right? And so, first is sports. They've taken a heavy focus on sports. This includes FIFA, right? There was the World Cup there recently, not in Saudi Arabia, but UAE, from what I remember. You've got Live Golf, this whole new golf. What would I even call it? League, something like that. A whole new golf league, we'll call it. And there have been questions about people from or players from America and Europe and these sorts of things taking these huge contracts, regardless of the fact that Saudi Arabia has some serious internal human rights abuse issues. You've got Newcastle United. They bought Newcastle United in England, sort of a storied soccer team. There was a lot of frustration from the citizens and the press, but apparently Prime Minister Boris Johnson helped push the deal through, and there were questions about like what happened there, and so now they own a soccer team. You can sort of see it here. And then they've really been trying to push into tennis as well. Tennis has been a little bit more has had a little bit more pushback, but there's a lot of money being thrown around, right? Okay. Slide 8, the sovereign wealth fund continues. So another realm that they've really been jumping into is media and entertainment. This includes video games. They've gone really hard at video game assets. I think not only because video games are sort of popular and rising, and at least some games and stuff seem to be pretty profitable, right? Like the Madden series and others. Um, but video games also offer them sort of an introduction or a foot in the door into the high-end computing realm, right? So all of the sort of the microchips that run the video processing in video games also tend to be the ones that AI wants to use, right? The graphical interface units, which is why NVIDIA became such a monstrous company, the largest on earth, worth maybe $4 or $5 trillion at this point, um, because their sort of graphic input cards, their chips that they were using for video game and 3D visuals, actually performs better and more energy efficiently in AI model training, right? And so it's boom. And the question is whether the Saudis have invested in these video games just to diversify their platforms or their assets, excuse me, or whether they're trying to sneak into the high world chip market, right? And that sort of realm. And recently, even I think that they were allowed to access some of the high end American chips, which are restricted to certain states. And Saudi Arabia had been off of there, had not been allowed to purchase them for fears that they were trying to get into the industry, and also fears that they would slide them to China, and they came off that list recently. So stuff to watch, right? Okay, video game companies include Capcom, Nexon, EA Sports, which is a huge one, right? FIFA, all the NBA games, Madden, etc. Activision Blizzard, which is another enormous company, and then they bought pieces of Nintendo, right? All right. We'll move on to sort of the media realm outside of video games. And this includes a sizable portion of X slash Twitter, whatever you want to call it. They had big interests in Live Nation. Live Nation recently took a pretty big hit from the U.S. Justice Department under anti monopoly laws. But they have a big chunk. They may have just lost their shirt on that one. I'm not really sure. You've got Meta and Facebook. They own a big portion of Zuckerberg's company. And then Disney's, platform, Disney, Marvel, all of that kind of stuff. Okay, next slide. Um, Miscellaneous, right? They also own big chunks of what I find to be concerning: Citigroup and Bank of America and SoftBank, all of which are like US tied banks, and then Credit Suisse, which is a monstrous investment bank. They own a big chunk of Uber. That makes you wonder about sort of the data and the tracking data inside the United States. They own POSCO Engineering and Construction, which is a massive construction company in the area that builds out infrastructure and stuff. They own a big portion of Boeing, which is a little bit concerning, right? There's only really two commercial jetliners on the planet: Boeing, which is based in America, and Airbus, which is based in Europe. They are highly competitive with each other, but there are also national security concerns over who gets investment in one of the only real commercial airliner companies on earth, right? And then Berkshire Hathaway, which is Warren Buffett's investment group. Okay, fourth, possible bribes, right? There is a lot of money going around through things like crypto and I don't know, these coins, not the coins, but the meme coins and stuff. Um, Jared Kushner interestingly got $2 billion for his hedge fund group, right? And there were even internal documents from the Saudis saying like, who is this guy, and like, why would we give him $2 billion, and what credentials does he possibly have? And Mohammed bin Salman just sort of pushed it through anyway. Steve Mnuchin, who was the Treasury Secretary under Trump 1, got $1 billion for his hedge fund group right after leaving office. And then we've seen billions of dollars pumped into Trump coins and these sorts of things from the Saudis, from UAE, from China, and others, which is also very concerning, right? And you have a right to, and I would even say that like Biden's kid was doing some of this too, right? At a much smaller level. He was getting what, like $500,000 from Burisma in Ukraine, and there are all kinds of weird questions about that too, right? But I'm a little sick of the equivocating and they're like, oh, they're doing it too. Like they should all go to jail, right? This is strange stuff, and the corruption is rife from the Saudis, especially. Okay, strategies for regional hegemony. We'll move on to sort of power projection. We're going to focus on the region, then we will focus internationally, and then the final piece will be all of the assortment of issues in the Middle East. All right, so what are the strategies for regional hegemony, right? As we talked about, some of these states really see themselves as the leader in this area or really want to be the leader in this area. Um, I'm not sure about Turkey. I think they just want to sort of progress and play the middle ground. But Iran, obviously, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and then as I suggest, oh, Israel, of course, and then as I suggested, probably Egypt. Like they would love to be a power player in the region again, right? Okay, so how do they do this? One is clientelist relationships, like we talked about. I've been hammered on, like, this is a big problem in this region. The bribes, right? The bribes, not only to those lucky enough to get sort of government jobs, but to military leaders, to foreign leaders, right? So that you can garner power in foreign countries. All of these kind of things. This includes investments, quote unquote, promises of aid, payouts to powerful interests, co-optation of rivals, not only domestically but also on the international scene. Um, Okay, second, we have sort of sanctions, right? We know that sanctions are a popular but not particularly useful tool that Western states in general can use to signal their frustration and to try to put, the argument is that they're trying to put pressure on the political leaders on the sanctioned state so that they'll back down. But what really happens is that the middle and lower classes get hit just extraordinarily hard. You tend to see further repression as a response. And so sanctions aren't necessarily great. Um, and one of the ways that some of these states project power in the region is by helping trouble states get around sanctions, right? They'll provide goods, maybe like food or that kind of assistance, or they will help them sneak in um, trade, right, through alternative borders, that kind of thing. So, not in the MidEast, but a good example of this is China and Vietnam, right? So post COVID, America wanted to move all its strategic supply lines. It started sanctioning China. It started telling companies, we want you to move your supply lines out of China. We want to diversify, et cetera, right? But what we learned years later is that China just moved their production facilities across the border to Vietnam and others. And so we're purportedly buying Vietnamese products, but they're made by Chinese companies with Chinese labor and Chinese management, and Chinese supplies, right? And so some of this happens in the Middle East too, in places like Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Egypt sometimes, right? These sorts of things. And so if you just say, all right, you're pissing me off, you're on your own on these sanctions, sometimes it'll get a state to bow a little bit. Okay, alliances. So we know that the sort of Sunni alliances are a strength generally in the area. And the US has, for the most part, chosen to not only support the Sunni bloc, but also to sort of, I would say, increase tensions between the Sunni and the Shia in the region, right? As a strategy to combat Iran. You also have the Abraham Accords, which again are mostly Sunni countries aligning with the West or with the US or Trump administration, or whatever you want to call it. You've got a lot of alliances with China and with Russia, right? We talked a little bit about these states, maybe not um, officially, but at least nominally, in a sense, they're all BRIC states, right? In the sense that they want to sort of delegitimize the West's rules, the West's debt system, the West's military power, all of these sorts of things, right? And they have sort of aligned with China, and China has also become a huge purchaser of oil from the region as well, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Okay, and then finally, I would say you kind of have an Iran versus Saudi proxy war going, where Iran and Russia have supported, Bashar al-Assad in Syria and some of the sort of really dictatorial and human rights abuses and like chemical warfare on rebels and these sorts of things. But they've also supported Yemen's civil war, right? And Saudi Arabia has generally found itself on the other side using U.S. military equipment to almost meta proxy for the U.S. It's getting weird, right? Like the Saudis are serving in a sense as the proxies for the United States in their war against Russia and Iran in Syria and Yemen. It's odd. There's a lot of stuff going on at once. All right, and then four, I would say image washing, right? Not only in the region but also internationally, and we sort of covered a lot of that. Okay, next slide. What are the strategies for international power, right? We just talked about how do you grow to be the hegemon in the region. I don't think any of them have any semblance of being the hegemon at the international level, but they all want to sort of jockey for power, right? And so first, again, you have bribes and investments, right? This region is throwing around arguably trillions of dollars to try and buy their way into diversification, but also power and privilege. Number two, you've got oil and power over the energy markets, right? Um, Number three, you've got a very strategic global positioning here, not only as sort of a land route across from Europe into sort of India and et cetera, but also obviously the Suez Canal, which saves a remarkable amount of time and energy going around the Horn of Africa, and the Strait of Hormuz, right, which is a sort of a pinpoint between the UAE and Iran, where 20% of global energy rolls through, and then another maybe 35% of all of the world's fertilizers. And this sort of thing like that, we're going to see inflation in the fall. Okay, let's see. BRICS, I talked about that. We'll skip it. Media influence. They are, not only the discussions we had about X and some of the media platforms like Disney that the Saudis are buying their way into. But you also have a very powerful media outlet in the region called Al Jazeera, and it's based in Doha, Qatar, right? And they put out some excellent news. It definitely tends to be sort of pro-Arab and pro-Palestinian and these sorts of things, right? Um, but they're a really solid news organization. Um, and they have growing influence not only in the Middle East but also in China, but also in Europe. Right? America, sadly enough, is like an ostrich who buries its head in the sand and doesn't ever pay attention to anything on the international market, which is weird to me. Right? If you look at any other media from around the world, they're constantly talking about China, oil markets, Middle Eastern power, Russia, etc. For some reason, America only wants to talk about America, and I don't really understand that. But Al Jazeera is a growing and pretty phenomenal media outlet. All right, number six. Uh, this region has worked very hard as America has transitioned to an exporter of oil to ensure that their oil goes to Asia. Right, it's a little bit easier to get it there. It's a short route. They're pretty safe routes as long as you get outside of sort of the Yemen area, right? But that's the other way. Um, but here you can see the top buyers of crude in Asia. A lot of these countries also operate on a lot of coal, right? So they have alternative energy sources. And one of those that includes Philippines and China and India, like a lot of coal are being burned in those places. But you could see here that like South Korea, Japan, India, China make up major portions, right? Um, and and this has been a concern for them, and this is actually leading to the entire world finally, it looks like, tipping the scale because of the Iranian war and the closure of Hormuz, moving toward renewables. And this is a major concern for the US, who is trying to become an oil exporter, and for the Middle East, who is only basically an oil exporter, as the world transitions to sort of renewable resources, right, which are becoming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Um, Oil is going to get left behind eventually, right? And the price will fall eventually. And so like there's got to be preparation for that eventually because Japan, South Korea all want to move in that direction. China is already moving in that direction, right? And then some of these other states like Malaysia, Philippines are thinking about like geothermal and stuff like that. Okay, final slide. What are the problems in the Middle East that sort of hold them back from becoming economic superpowers, right? We've got a bunch here. The debt crises we've talked about. Another big problem we haven't talked too much about in this class is their agricultural import problem, right? They don't have much arable land. There are a few states like Egypt and Iraq where there are sort of river basins where they can grow agricultural products, but the vast majority of these states are agricultural importers, and inflation hits these countries hard, right? Not only do you have sort of high unemployment, frustration in the population, but when inflation and food prices rise, it hits incredibly hard in this region, right? And this is part of the reason for the explosion in the Arab Spring around 2014, and I am predicting that this is going to cause problems in the fall and the winter of this year, because of what we were talking about earlier, the fertilizer prices, agricultural inputs for energy, for steel, for plastics, everything, right, that they need to produce agricultural products. All of those inputs are rising, right, because of this Hormuz problem, and food is going to rise. We're already sort of seeing the cracks appear. Inflation rose a lot last month, mostly because of Hormuz, and that's going to feed in, especially as we're maybe in planting season now, but as we start to move on, food costs are going to be rising pretty drastically in the fall, I think. and this is going to hit the area hard, and it might cause some real issues. Okay, number three, some more problems. The human rights and dictators dilemma stuff, right? When your citizens aren't free to actually tell you the problems in your society, you have a remarkably rosy picture of how your society works, right? And this is sort of what happens when just massive uprisings happen, right? Um, they're pretty rare, but when they do happen, things just evolve remarkably rapidly, right? And this is sort of what happened when the wall fell in 1989, and arguably the French Revolution and some of these other things. Okay, number four, reliance on oil as the world transitions away. We were touching on it just a minute ago, but the world is transitioning, right? And a lot of states, especially Europe, we're already moving in this direction post Ukraine and the oil crisis that happened then, but also because of global climate change. Uh, and this has only exacerbated the problem and shown citizens of many states across the world that like we can't rely on oil anymore. This is becoming too much, right? And so we're seeing huge investments in infrastructure and renewable projects coming out this last couple of months, right? And so it looks like the world is finally transitioning away. This will empower China, and it will depower the Middle East. America, sadly enough, has left the green market behind, so we have been left behind. China dominates this industry. They dominate EVs around the world with their little BYDs and whatever. They dominate the solar panel markets. Some of the Northern European countries are pretty good at I don't know, wave break systems to collect energy, and also the offshore wind and these sorts of things. But in almost every sense, China is leading the way, and the more the world shifts that way, the more China is going to be empowered, right? Because they are putting out products that are well built and sort of cheaper than anything the rest of the world can make. Not only because they've spent years sort of testing and building out this technology through their sort of 20-year plan, um, but also because of all the money that the state throws at it to keep it cheap, and currency manipulations to support exports and all sorts of stuff, right? So there's a lot of reasons why China's leading here, but they are. There's really no question about it. The U.S. may be doing the worst in this. It seems like our administration wants to go backward instead of forward. So this worries me that we're going to be left behind here. Yeah. Okay. Next, unemployment is very high in this region, especially for youth and women. We've touched on that. Black markets are enormous in this area, not only sort of labor markets, but the local bazaars and all kinds of stuff, right? There's a lot of black market work going on. It makes it difficult to count bodies. It makes it difficult to collect taxes. It makes it difficult to run a judicial system, all this sort of stuff. Religious tensions, we've talked about a lot. Really poor infrastructure. The infrastructure that has been built out has largely been either military or petroleum in general. Number nine, you've got a lot of civil wars and mass migration and coups d'etat and all kinds of stuff, right? There's a lot of political instability in this region. There is the support for terrorist groups or freedom fighters, whatever you want to call them, like Hamas in Palestine, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, all supported by the Iranians, and that's only the letter H, right? There are more and more out there, and there's more supported sort of by the Saudis as well, a little more quietly, right? Okay, you've also got the Palestine Israel problem. There's got to be a solution there before there's ever really going to be any clarity or stability in the region. You've got terrorism and proxy wars that kind of touches on the civil wars from above. there's a lack of democracy, right? And so, in many senses, the West even almost can't get involved because their citizens will ask questions like, "Why are we doing deals with undemocratic human rights abusers?" And so that causes some tensions, right? Labor immigration and labor rights, the arms race. We've seen one of the maps before where they're spending incredible portions of their GDP on military technology, training, equipment, etc. Like disproportionate, huge portions of their GDP on military, right? And this can cause, in some sense, an arms race, right? And can force war upon states because of misunderstandings of intentions or all kinds of stuff. You have rising Iranian capacity. And I know that sounds ironic given that they're at war with the US and they've been bombed for months. But we've learned that they're a rather strong society. They have been thoughtful about fragmenting their leadership so that you can't just kill a couple people and sort of end their regime, right? They have learned that they have this remarkable power in controlling the Strait of Hormuz, and I don't really know how we wrest control from them. There are mines everywhere in the area, and apparently, I've been doing some research. This mine clearing game is sort of a probabilities game. Um, a really good percentage of mine clearing in the area would probably be around 85%. That still means maybe 1 in 7 mines is still undetectable, right? They also have maybe the world's leading drone military capacity. Iran does. They've been not only supporting the Russian war in Ukraine for many years, and they've learned some remarkable things about drone construction, doing it cheaply and effectively, um, and also drone strategy, right? Which makes their control over Hormuz even more difficult to sort of wrest from them. And then finally, war tends to sharpen militaries. We've learned this, right? And sometimes it can go really badly. Like we talked about, Egypt's adventurism in Yemen went really poorly, right? But oftentimes, war can really sharpen your military, at least relative to those around you. You learn new techniques. Your leadership and soldiers get training. Um, they know what it looks like and experience less sort of what do they used to call it, shell shock. These sorts of things. Okay. The final problem in the Middle East that I have, I'm sure there are more, right? Is remittances. Remittances. This means that those who have emigrated to another country will take a portion of their salary and send it home, right? So think like generally Mexican nationals in the 1990s. Today it's like Hondurans and Guatemalans and Venezuelans and Nicaraguans. They'll work in the U.S. in construction or housing or whatever, and then take a portion of their earnings and send them home to their family, right? And this can be really difficult for countries to deal with. It's hard to collect taxes on them. It's in some senses it reduces the incentive to try and I don't know entrepreneurship and stuff like that in home countries. And so, yeah, remittances like they're wonderful because they keep people afloat and alive, but they can also sort of cause problems with your economy um, and flood the economy with things like U.S. dollars and sort of devalue your own currencies. So those can cause problems too. Okay, that's enough. Thank you so much for being here. I will start grading papers immediately and then shift into the next section. Have a great day.